Hello.
Brian, is this working already? Are we good?
I think so. Yes. Perfect. Oh, wow. Holy cow. Pleasure
How's
to
it going?
it is great. Great. I mean, considering, it's the holiday season, so a little stressful. I'm a mailman by trade by day. So,
Oh, early morning or what's your hours?
it's tricky. I end up working it'll change predominantly, especially during the holiday, like Christmas. It'll change. It kind of shifts between like 6 and 8 a.m.
Oh, okay.
So generally I'm done at, say, like 4 to 6
Mhm,
also. So I mean, it's nice because I started working night shifts originally. I was one of those
mhm,
package sorting guys, which is kind of how I got really into music and podcasting essentially. So
mhm. Yeah, I like those night shift jobs. I always find them kind of fascinating.
yeah.
My friend Doug, growing up, he in high school, he had the night shift job at the grocery store.
Okay.
And in the summertime, I'd sort of switch to more nocturnal hours in the summertime as a teenager. And I'd bike out a couple kilometers out to see him on his break at like 2 in the morning. And it would be him and like six or seven dude, like lifer night shift guys, right? That have been there forever. And he's like the teenager. And we'd sit out there and smoke cigarettes and like just like, you know, talk smack out there. It was like so I always love those night shift jobs. They're
Yeah,
always
it's
yeah.
fun. I mean, it was nice because when I started working specifically like 2007. I just to give you a little history. I mean, this is the first time we're meeting. We're on the podcast.
Yeah,
I'm tracking.
yeah.
But welcome to the Zanzizi podcast. It's a history
Cheers.
show. um, but obviously I'm super excited because one of my musical idols. Like I've been a huge fan of you for
Thank you.
basically since I was 19 and I got August Everywhere and it changed my life. So
Amazing.
um yeah, no, I was heartbroken. It was the last day of senior year of high school. I got my heart smashed, and I was just laying in the back of my friend's Buick listening to that album, and you helped me get through it. So
Wow.
yeah,
Wow. Amazing.
yeah.
Was that like summer 2000 or something?
2001 actually.
2001. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, because it was your album. So initially I was a huge fan of Failure and in
Right.
high school, and then I'd found out that Ken had sang backup on your album, and I was like, oh my God. And then Kelly Scott, and then from there I was like obsessed with that your album, and then from there a lot of that was kind of how I found my way into different bands at the time in high school. So, but yeah.
The failure gateway drug into other bands.
Yes, yes.
I know. I know. It's really become a thing like over the decades, like as an entry point to other artists that yeah, there's sort of like this own like sub genre sort of based around them in a way, that's sort of evolved over the years.
Well, what's interesting too is that a lot of you guys, and this is coming from a guy who's such a huge fan of that, of all of you guys' output, but and specifically yours, you guys all seem to have this authenticity that
Mm,
that is, but also seems very humbled. If that makes any sense, like you're all
mhm.
creatives who have passions but are very driven to do music because they love it, not necessarily because, like, oh, I'm really talented at this, this is just kind of a gig. It feels like it's more of a passion than with other groups sometimes. At least I feel that way.
And certainly like if I look at my musical peers and friends that you're talking about, that we are all musically self-motivated to do this and always kind of have been. And I guess, yeah, I think you're right about that. And there was Ken Ken, who you know from Failure, of course.
Yes,
Who
Ken
we're
Andrews.
talking about, just for anyone who doesn't know. Yeah. I remember we had this talk like a few years after, you know, those sort of like the years when we were getting funded by major label money, right? And so that was like a different way of making records that all of us have, like, by necessity, we don't really make records like that anymore unless someone approaches us with a huge budget for whatever reason, which doesn't happen all that much. So I remember, like, we were having this dinner once, and his perspective on it was that, like, the bands that kind of got signed for the right reasons in the late 90s and were allowed to make these artistic records, for lack of a better term, but you know what I mean, like, very sort of, we would have made them anyway, but the major label money certainly allowed us to realize our vision in a right. You know, in an accelerated fashion. And being together and sort of being around each other's projects, specifically like stopping by the studio, was like sort of a very ordinary thing with that group of people during those years. The cross-pollination was like measurable and palpable, you know. And sort of his perspective, to get back to it, was that, like, that may have been, and this was only like 5 or 6 years after, but I think he's proven correct, is that he was like, that may have been the last sort of era of when large corporations looked at small groups of creative people and said, those kids are onto something. We don't need to understand it. We just know something cool's going on over there. And I don't want the other label to get there first. So I'm going to go over there and investigate this cool group of, you know, self-driven, just like real deal artists. So that may have been like, you know, when I was signed right after, I was signed to DreamWorks. I was signed to A&M first, but I was signed to Dream, which was a different thing. You know, being signed to DreamWorks was a different experience, of course. And Elliott Smith had just been signed the year before by the same guy that I was signed by. Luke Wood was the A&R guy. And, you know, so I was around like the demo process of, you know, that stuff that was going on. And even just like, I could make a list of like 5 albums that have not come out that are genius albums funded by the major. There was a band called Chihuahua from like 1997 or 98. And there was this CDR floating around LA. And it was, Ken put me onto it. And and someone put Ken onto it. The Lutefisk album, which was abandoned by A&M, you know, in the end of A&M's independence, when they got bought up by Universal Seagram's, and had to drop swaths of bands. The one band, I found the promo CD out in the barn the other day, and it's this band Lutefisk. And you know, like, they were sort of like the kings of the Silver Lake scene for about 6 months or a year or maybe more. And they did this sort of epic the wall like double album, and all their hopes and dreams were into it. And, you know, everything got sort of slashed. There's a bunch of records like that didn't make the cut. But there was a bunch that did, you know, the Lust record, the Failure records, the Medicine records. And they all hold up very well, I find.
So you're talking about that. What led up to that, though, like specifically for you? Because I just to give some context to people, you Blinker the Star, you started, and you at this point to today, you have like 12 records at this point, which is an incredible amount of material. And I can say this as a fan of yours, like every record, at least to me, is great. Like
Oh,
there's
thank you.
there are albums like, I mean, and really the second half of your career has just been phenomenal. Like every time you put something out, I'm like day one listening to it and I'm like,
Oh, thank
how's he keep doing this? Like this is so good. And the
you.
production is so good. And like the vocal takes are amazing. And like having, you know, I'm a huge fan of Alan Epley. So seeing him guest with you is just like, holy cow, like this guy's amazing. Like,
Yeah,
you know, so
yeah, I'm a big fan too. That was really fun. But what was your question? Like, how
I
did
was,
I
yeah,
get
how did
in
it get
mixed
started?
into all of that? Right.
Yeah.
So Blink of the Star was signed by A&M Records in 1994. And, you know, there was this sort of like feeding frenzy of grunge bands, for lack of a better term. We were like 19, 20 years old, three-piece band. One song sounded like Nirvana, one song sounded like Pixies, one song sounded like Pavement, and one song sounded like The Breed. You know, we were just like everything that we loved, that Guided by Voices, everything we loved that year sounded like the first album. And we just like record it in my mom's basement. And so it was that sort of like very young energy. So A&M, for whatever reason, they heard the album. Actually, a couple of labels heard it, came up to see us play in Montreal. A&M were the ones that were sort of like, they're the best reputation out of the labels that had approached us. And it was like the right amount of money and the right amount of like, oh, you know, they have the Police, and they had signed a bunch of they had Soundgarden. So that was like a big, cool thing, you know. I think the Soundgarden thing was like why we were really excited about A&M.
I love
So we
Sad.
signed A&M,
They're one
and
of my
we're,
favorites.
yeah. So uh
Sorry.
we do like the first two Blinker albums are basically very sort of their period. We're living in Montreal as a three-piece band. And when we go out to record the second album is when I sort of meet Ken, and when Ken produces that record. And during that trip, I start to meet, you know, people people in the circle of musicians and stuff. And I'm like, wow, LA is cool. I go back to Canada. I guess we tour for a little while, and then I go out. I get this weird invite to go work with Courtney Love at the
Oh,
end of the tour cycle for Bourgeois Kitten. So I go out and spend like 4 months while living with Courtney Love in Hollywood. So that extended my sort of circle, and it extended my knowledge and fascination with Los Angeles. So I was like, you know, this is the place for me.
mm-hmm.
So a few short months later, I moved out. I think like 4 or 5 months later, I moved out. Again, I got lucky. I asked Ken, because I was going to move to San Francisco, and Ken talked me out. He was like, you know, that might be fun and everything because it's so, you know, I had a lot of friends up there. But he was like, you're going to thrive in LA, you know, like you're going to learn and move quickly in LA. And he was totally right. So, and it actually was cheaper back then too. So probably still is. Moved to LA, and kind of got lucky because Ken's friend Matt Marshall, who was A&R guy at Zoo, who had signed Tool, had a guest house behind his house that was available for rent at a reasonable rate. And I was signed to A&M still, so I moved into the guest house, and you know, right away. So he had signed Lusk as well, so it was like we had kind of like a party in the backyard, and at that first party, that's where I met Paul Demore and Greg from Failure, and
Greg
Chris Pitt,
Edwards.
Brad Lehner, and Ken came, and this whole extended gang of musicians and very cool creative people all of a sudden became my friends. And that period very short period of maybe a year and a half was where I just absorbed and was able to absorb and then, you know, express all this stuff that I learned.
Totally.
Yeah, so it was like a really rapid learning and discovery phase of like, because they were just turning me on to such cool music as well. Just like, what?
Mhm.
And yeah, I mean, that was just like a very accelerated learning period. And then that August Everywhere came out of that period.
Now, when you mentioned it was a three piece initially, did they quit, or was it like, okay, I'll just take over the songwriting since I'm the singer or guitar player and we'll just have like backup musicians? Was that
The original model of like the sort of semi autocratic, semi-democratic three-piece grunge band was the model for like the first two records. And then once I had sort of spent time doing stuff in LA, I realized that I could make records on my own just if I needed someone to do something specialty. I didn't want to be locked into my two pals that I went to high school with that, were not seasoned musicians. I wanted, so my models became more my preteen idols and my teen idols, which were Prince and Lindsey Buckingham, who were fairly autocratic in their methods. And because they were able to, and they could do it, and they could work fast and faster than most people. And that was sort of because, I mean, I kind of also got lucky. My parents owned a musical instrument store. So I had recording gear when I was 11 years. I had a 4-track studio when I was 11 years old. I was writing songs and recording. So, by the time I was in my early 20s, I was ready for all that stuff because I had all the basics kind of figured out.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Now, when you started writing August Everywhere, did you know, like, was there like a certain set of songs, or were you just like writing every day? Did it all hit you at once, or was it a gradual thing?
I'll tell you exactly the moment I knew what kind of record it was going to be. So Ken and I had done Bourgeois Kitten together, and that was a certain kind of record. I mean, it was not that focused. It was still sort of grungy, but it was like hinting at something maybe a little artier going on. But Ken and I had become really close collaborators and friends. And so at the end of that cycle, I went out, did the Courtney thing, came back home for a couple months. And when I moved out there the next summer, I came out with maybe 7 or 8 demos. And the first one, so Ken was like, I want to hear what you're doing. Come on, let's hear it. So we go into his room, and I play him September Already demo. And as soon as he heard the arpeggio in the chorus, before there's even a vocal, he hit stop on the CD player and he just went, I want to produce this record. That's literally what happened. So
Yeah, that's awesome.
then I was like, okay, because I had written a bunch of different songs. I'd written a couple sounds like, I was like, well, I could do like a Foo Fighters record, or maybe I could do like a blah, blah. But the song that came from the heart was September Already, which I wrote in a very, very emotional state and an extremely hungover state.
Oh yeah.
The demo of that, you can hear the alcohol damage and stuff on my vocals on the demo. And but there was something in the style of that that there was this development. I'd heard the Lusk record, I think, or was like on the verge of that. And the cool people in LA that I met were sort of like, get rid of your triple rectifier. Don't need that anymore. Remove, here's Surf's Up by the Beach Boys. You need to check this out. What? You don't know Surf's Up? Okay. and listen to Steven from the Flaming Lips, because that guy has all the answers. That was sort of like what was going on in LA. So once I had gotten that confidence from Ken, I was like, okay, I know sort of what kind of record this could be, but there was still a lot of room for exploration. I met Brad Lehner and we became weekly songwriting buddies. So I go over to his house and we'd write a song a week.
That's awesome.
And so we ended up writing like, I don't know, maybe 40 or 45 songs, most of which have not come out. And every couple of years, we talk and sort of like say, God, we got to put those out.
You mentioned that you were writing for Courtney Love. What was that process like? Did you guys become very close? Was it like you guys would journal together, or lyrics, or was it
lyrics were all hers, completely
okay.
all hers, with a big yellow legal pad at all times. We wrote in a couple different guises. We wrote over at her house,
Mm-hmm.
and just with acoustic guitars.
Okay.
I remember we were trying to write a song for Fleetwood Mac. I remember that was a thing, and we had this song that we thought Stevie would like, and so I was like playing Lindsay and she was playing Stevie, but no, they didn't like it, and then more often we would write as a band. So basically, she brought me in as I knew Melissa. Melissa, the bass player, and I. That was sort of my entree, but so we knew each other very well because we were in Tinker in Montreal together. She joined Hole, and then after that, I got invited to come and write with Hole.
Oh,
So,
wow.
but it was Courtney's thing. It wasn't Melissa's thing. Courtney wanted me there, so she brought me into the rehearsal. Their rehearsal situations are writing situations. So they jam on a riff, or Eric or someone will have a riff, and then they jam on it, and then Courtney sort of works on lyrics and melody as they're jamming the riff. That's kind of how they were writing at the time. So I was brought in as this sort of, extra fifth wheel or whatever, and they would play the song, and then she'd go, "Do you hear anything?" And sometimes I'd have a chord change, and everyone was super suspicious and like not stoked for me to be there at first.
Oh, I don't know why. You'd be perfect. Like, I don't know. Having somebody with that kind of knowledge seems like a great idea, but.
Well, I was 10 years younger than everyone except Melissa, so I was sort of a kid. So, but I was, I was malleable. My ego was in check. I wasn't a threat to any. They quickly discovered I wasn't a threat to any stability, to the stability of the band, and I was there merely as an adjunct to suggest perhaps a new chord that they wouldn't have used here or there, and that was played out by within 5 or 6 nights. Eric would call me at home or wherever I was staying at, hotel for a few nights, and then I was staying at Courtney's place. But living my own kind of life separate from her. She had her own Hollywood stuff going on. So then Eric would call me and he'd be like, "Hey, you want to go see Bluebird tonight?" And we go out and check out bands and like go all over. He would take me to the weirdest places. He grew up there. So
Right on.
That was an education in itself. So, and I became friends with Patty, and Melissa and I were already close. So that was, yeah. So that the process was me in the rehearsal room with them mostly. Is sort of like, that's how the one song that I have a co-write on that's on Celebrity Skin was born out of that process. I came up with this chord sequence in the chorus, and Courtney was like, "Oh, cool, that's the Alice in Chains part." So I came up with the Alice in Chains part.
Very cool. So yeah, you were talking about the process, and Ken immediately being like, "Yeah, I'm in. Let's do this. Let's work together on this." Now, and obviously, I love that record, and the record went on to be, I would say, at least to me, I was recommended it too. Like later on, after I had gotten into it, I heard other guys talking about it, like specifically guys in bands would reference it like, oh man, have you heard this record? Like I was, like I said, I was in the service. I remember one time the song Pretty Pictures came on while we were all at like an Applebee's of all places. And I'm like, that's Blinker the Star. Like,
Uh-huh.
and this other guy was like, oh yeah, I love this song. And I was like, I was like, how do you know this? I know this is my band. You don't know about this band, like kind of like
Yeah.
this possessive type love fandom with what you do. But yeah, it obviously I love that record, but I really like I'm not joking when I say like the second half that you've been pushing these records out. And I wouldn't say pushing, like lovingly crafting these records, because they're real amazing. Like I know the most recent album, Animal Math, is so good.
Oh, thank
Careful is Careful with Your Magic, right? I don't want to say that wrong.
you. No, that was it. Yeah.
There's 12
Yeah.
records, so sometimes I might
No,
say,
I know. I mess up the titles myself. Don't worry.
but I love that record. And I mean, so Still in Rome is the next one after August Everywhere, right?
Yeah, there was sort of a long pause because like I got dropped from DreamWorks, but they gave me some money, so I was able to build the studio in Pembroke
Okay.
and sort of like cheaply exist. And then I kind of like, as a producer, I had a hit up here in Canada with the Sam Roberts record. And so there was this basically what the universe was kind of presenting was like, hey, you're not on a major anymore, but you can produce, you have this little momentum to produce records, at least up here in Canada. So that was kind of my life for 10 years, was like recording bands downtown Pembroke and people coming up from all over the place. And that was kind of my thing. And so I put out a record. I did Still in Rome, but then nothing came out as Blinker for like 9 years after that.
Right. That's right. So
I did a record as Abby with my friend Sophia Silva, which was, in the Blinker zone.
mm-hmm.
But, and then Sheloom, I did some like duo records with my friend Filippo.
I saw that. Yeah, I've listened to like little pieces here and there of stuff.
Yeah.
I kept up on Blinker for sure. But you've been pretty prolific with that back, because you're back in Canada now. If we haven't mentioned it, this is an international podcast today, which is great.
Yeah.
But we like to think of Canada as our friendly upstairs neighbors. And I mean, I'm from Michigan, so I'm basically Canada light.
Same landmass. Yeah.
Yeah. But so during that break, did you know you wanted to go back to the Blinker the Star stuff, or was it kind of?
Yeah, but I would say that before 2000, I would say it like 2000, there was like this weird, for people who'd been on major labels, trying to transition into this sort of new world and stuff, and everything was sort of chaotic business wise, as in the early 2000s. It was like Napster, and there was like, what's going on? And there was no way to monetize anything digitally at that point.
Mm-hmm.
Until Bandcamp sort of came around in 2008. And when that happened, then I was like, oh, okay, this is like the answer to my prayers, sort of. Like now there's a format, like a regular sort of standardized, semi-standardized format where you can upload records and maybe break even or make a little profit somehow. There was a way forward, at least, sort of in the beginning of Bandcamp. Yeah. And then there was a day when I was recording this band, and my friend Daryl, who was in the band, we were like having dinner after the session, and he got kind of spooky on me, and he was just kind of like, how come we're not releasing any records, man? And I was like, oh, well, I will. He's like, time's a ticking, better get on it. It's been a long time. That was like 2010. And that moment passed, and I kept thinking about it. And it was like, started weighing heavy on me.
Mm-hmm.
I was like, He's right.
I'm glad he said something, Jordan, because you needed to. Because this shit is so good, man. Like you were needed. Like
Well, I
it
didn't, yeah, I didn't feel terribly needed. And the other thing was is that my self-identity had kind of, because I'd done so much producing, you know, in those years, my identity kind of switched from artist to like producer, engineer. And the other sort of moment was my friend Tom was in the studio, and I can't remember what precipitated his comment. It was something to the effect of me saying, like, sort of saying, I'm just a technician or something. And he actually grabbed me by the shoulders and went, if there's anyone I know who's an artist, it's you, Jordan. Don't forget that. So
yeah,
those two things kind of happened at that time. So those were sort of like moments where I was like, oh, okay, I
he's
gotta
like
get in,
he's
I gotta
like
get into here.
he's like, bitch, you wrote Below the Sliding Doors. Get in the studio, pick up a guitar,
That was it.
play the
That's exactly
piano.
the message. That was the message in different ways from both of those people.
Yeah.
So that's what happened.
Well, it's crazy because you did it. You came back. Speaking of your friend Ken, he comes back hard with Failure, and they sound amazing.
Yeah.
Talbot and Hum like got his band back together. They recorded another album. Like all these great '90s, early aughts bands who were just so prolific in writing just beautiful, heartfelt records were just like, you know what, you know, people are living longer. Why the, you know, we got stuff to write. Let's keep painting on the canvas. Let's keep creating because it's important, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. And the business side of it is now sort of like you can choose your model. You can choose your business model now. They're out there. Before there was a lack of business models there was a lack of platform.
Right. I
You
get
know?
that though. I mean, I really do think the early aughts is kind of a dark age, especially for the music industry. And it was a very like foggy area as far as like, well, what?
Artists were lost. I can
Yeah,
tell you, just like being in the trenches then, artists were absolutely lost and just sort of kind of continuing their projects, but without any real impetus or light at the end of the tunnel. Like, how is this going to come? We're going to print up a bunch of CDs and lose 20 grand again? No,
no.
you know?
Yeah. So
So
so you eventually came back. It was like you said it was about 2010-ish. You had the conversation.
yeah, those things started to sink in. By 2011, I started, what I realized at that time is I needed to book myself,
Mm-hmm.
just as if someone else had booked me, because I can always say yes to another session from someone. There's always some work I can say yes to that will occupy my day and prevent me from working on my own music. So what I realized at that point is I needed to just book off, I think 6 weeks or something. And I had like 3 or 4 things written, 2 things half written, but I had to write 5 new songs and like really, okay, this has to happen. I have to birth this, and I have to, like, it has to come out of nowhere. What am I going to do? So that was We Draw Lines, was
I
that
love
process.
I love that record. Honestly,
Thanks.
they're I went through a divorce at one point in like
Mm-hmm.
2017. And I think it's the last track on that song I used to listen to quite a bit. It was part of my breakup playlist. You seem to end up in there. Actually, you've also ended up on I'm in Love Again playlist quite a bit too. So you seem to go the whole spectrum, sir.
Are those my two themes? Are those my two great themes?
Well, Wild Something, like I have 3 daughters and we'll hum along to that song all the time. Like they're legitimately starstruck that I'm even interviewing you today.
Oh, sweet. That's sweet.
Totally. And I am too. I'm trying. I mean, I went out to dinner with my friend Marty, also co-host of the show, and he's like, make sure you know, don't fanboy out too much. I'm like, I don't know if I can help it. You know, the guy kind of was the soundtrack to a lot of moments of my life. So,
Oh, that's really sweet. That's really nice to hear, honestly.
but So We Draw Lines was you had to book your own time,
Yeah.
and obviously you like you'd said you had a bit of an identity kind of thing going as a producer, mixer, studio guy. And you had started when you started doing the studio thing, you that was back in Canada, or did you start it initially in LA? Or
I came back to Canada after what happened? We finished, I think, yeah, we did some overdubs for Still in Rome, summer 2002. And then, yeah, then I was like kind of in business, like summer, like fall 2002 is when things kind of started up at the studio for me. It was kind of like a big storage space at first. And then I started realizing that it's like, I, this is like really cheap. And I could just sort of, it's not like the most, it's not like meant to be a studio. It's like above a bank. So it's like a weird, it's like an old assessment office or something. It's like pillar, like weird, beams and stuff for plug-ins and stuff. It's odd, and like awful carpet from the 90s. But I made it my own, and that was, yeah, that was the base of operations for about 15 years until I moved out here. This is like a farm scenario out here, like a free building that I built just out of nowhere in the middle of a cornfield.
kind of love that. It gets that little bit of like almost seclusion, like artist kind of.
A lot of that.
Yeah. Which is
Dangerously.
well, it could be, I don't know how it has evolved for you, but I mean, as I get older, I definitely feel like, because I write music too, and it's for me, um where I practice at is kind of like that. It's a very kind of secluded area, remote, and when we write, it's in a garage, like kind of turned into like a half shed, half garage into the side of a house building, and we have electricity and all that, and it's always real nice and dim in there, like low lighting and just lots of
Yeah.
pedals and but there's still nothing quite like that, that creative, when the creative juices is going and you're just messing with tone, and just like an eruption will happen and you'll just come up with something great. I get that sense when I listen to your music too, but it must be tricky because it feels like on at least these last couple records, you were writing um and playing a lot of the parts yourself. Do you normally start with, say, like your primary instrument, like a guitar or piano, or do you start with drums or a vocal line?
Never a vocal line, almost never, but yeah, usually the harmonic element. Well, I'll start with a harmonic element, which usually is like a keyboard or a guitar or a bass
Okay.
or a beat. Sometimes it just starts with like, I really like the BPM of that song I heard the other day, whatever that BPM is, and I'll
Mm-hmm.
just like tap the BPM in and then maybe just lay down that
Mm-hmm.
quickly and then build off of that. Sometimes I'll have like a vibe idea, like, oh, I want this to be like like I'll sort of have an ingredient list, of like, the drums could be, 1981 Steely Dan, and the bass could be 1986 Susie and the Banshees or something like that.
Ooh, I like your influences. I can tell we would get along on a long car ride, and that I enjoy that.
But
Uh,
then sometimes just like I find on the keyboard, if I'm writing on keyboard, it tends to be a little less premeditated and a bit. It's because I'm so comfortable on guitar that I need to trick myself to do interesting things on it.
hmm.
So what that usually means is alternate tunings.
Oh, I was gonna ask you, do you like to do standard or more buzzy drop tunings, or half step up, half step down?
Um, Sometimes I'll just start with like a Joni Mitchell tuning, like and then if I find a string awkward, I'll just change it. So sometimes I'm not sure what it is. Like most of the guitars around me here are in very, very random tunings. And what I have to do is remind myself when I after I've written the part
Mm-hmm.
to open up a separate track in Pro Tools and just write the word tuning and then ring each string of the guitar and then put it off to the side for the future because I'll need to know that at some point, whether it's to record more stuff on the song or like if I ever want to play that live. And that's come in handy a couple times where I was, because I play these songs once and they're gone.
I
And
did the same thing. I'm like, shit, that was in like ISIS tuning, like B flat something. I'm like, I'm never
well,
gonna remember that.
yeah, so you literally have to learn your songs
Mm-hmm.
to reproduce them in any way. And I remember when we did shows like in 2019, the bass player Tom, he goes, yeah, your songs are weird. They seem simple enough on the outside, but if any one of us plays the part differently than the way you showed us, it screws the whole thing up. I was like, yeah, I never thought about that before. Is that what I'm doing?
You're like, I didn't set out to create Sonic Youth, but here we are. Hey, I appreciate that though, because like sometimes it takes that, like, because I mean, it's not like everybody has the greatest guitars when they're starting out, and sometimes inspiration will come when something is just a little off. It's like the greatest recordings ever have those little sense of like human flaw or human ability,
Grit,
whatever.
yeah, absolutely, yeah. And I think the new record is like there are things that led me to really sort of embrace that. There's a lot of first take stuff,
Mm-hmm.
and and working alone, a lot of the times I do have to imagine the really talented, intelligent people that I've met over the years or that are in my life, and I have to imagine them being here with me now sometimes
I get
when
that.
I don't know what to do. So I sort of imagine, like my friend Jimmy once, he was sort of like he stayed with me for a summer and he sort of witnessed me working on other people's stuff and my own stuff. And he noticed a difference where I was a lot more sort of like cavalier and vibey on other people's stuff. And then I would get too uptight on my own stuff. And so he was like insisted that he engineer me for a few nights. And so I would do, a bunch of sort of like, to me, sort of a bit too wild first takey stuff. And he would just hit stop and he was like, you're done.
Yeah.
And when I listened back a day later, I was like, whoa, that's cool. Like I wouldn't have done that. He's like, no, you would have erased it. And I was like, yeah, you're right. So I sort of have become better at being looser, um, not as judgmental, I guess as judgmental, but allowing rough edges to slip through the cracks more.
I
Certainly on the last record.
I think the record is honestly, I think it's phenomenal and probably
Thank you.
one of the best records of, if not one of my best records of 2023, maybe even at the top. It's so good. And I
Thanks.
think one of the things that I like about it personally is that, and you probably have heard this, but what I like about the last couple records really is that some records feel really bloated. And what I like about it is not necessarily that it's not missing like the creative, like say jam element of like a song shifting and new textures coming in. I like that it's like 8 songs usually in about 30 to 40 minutes ish. It's like a
Yeah.
nice, concise chunk in a way. And
Mm-hmm.
it's kind of what I like. It's another thing of what I miss about movies from say the 90s too, is like a nice hour and a half film. You're in, you're out, your popcorn, your experience, you had a great time. It's the same. And I'm not saying it's like bad in any way. Like I think it's a good thing that like it gets, you get what you want out of it. And it's an immediate, like just creative like thing and a joy, like a really great just inspiration too, like that you're able to kind of cull it down and just make it like a very fine piece from A to B. I'll just keep
Yeah,
praising you. So
no, I definitely consciously keep the records pretty short, because there's enough layers to sort of keep you coming back. Hopefully, if you like the songs initially, then there's layers that, you may hear on second or third listen that you maybe didn't hear the first time. And there's enough of that stuff that I don't ever feel the need to make a long album statement, you know.
no,
I
I get
feel that
that.
I feel that like, yeah, this journey is really meant to be 35 minutes long, like it really, and then you sort of go, oh, that's whoa, that's it. Okay,
That's it.
cool.
Well, what's funny is a lot of times when I'll listen to one of like a Blink of the Star album, it'll immediately recommend me like something else like as the album ends, and I'll be like, this doesn't sound like, and then I'll look and I'm like, oh, this is, like I'm trying to remember who it recommended. It recommends me bands sometimes when I'll listen to you guys, and
I
it's,
want to know who.
yeah, it was interesting. Like it ended up being this band. Oh, it was this band called Lady Hawk that came up, and I really dug it. Like I've been listening to it quite a bit. Yeah, Lady Hawk, the album's called No Can Do, and it comes up a lot when I'm listening to you guys, and I'm like, this is great. Like, thank you, Jordan. You influenced you. Yeah, obviously your music links to these, but
I want those recommendations, though. As the creator, I don't get them.
I get it. I get it. Because
I
it's
guess
like,
if I logged out of YouTube and created a new account who was a fan of myself, then I would get cool recommendations that you're getting. Damn.
yeah. Well, that's
Yeah.
the joy of being a Blink of the Star fan. You get all this other great stuff on the side. So
Well, I'm going to check out Lady Hawk. It does ring a bell. Maybe I've heard it, but I'm going to check it out later for sure.
totally, totally. So
Yeah.
what you okay, so you talked about how it started, the break, producing. Is there is you mentioned live performances.
Mm.
Do you think that with the wealth of material that you have now, I mean, you could play like a 2.5 hour show easily. Um,
Mm.
have you thought about live performances down the road or how you want to do stuff like that?
Yeah, I'm thinking about it. Like I don't do it very often because I do generally prefer to be in the studio. So the sort of like model I've been sort of not really a model, but it's like what I did last time was I I just went out and did 5 or 6 shows.
Mm-hmm.
And it's weird though, because like at the end of it, the band was really good. And at the end of those shows, the band is just starting to really gel, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so my feeling as a musician is this hungry feeling of like, damn, we should take this on the road. There's not like a lot of like reason to do that unless like Beck called or something like, and said, I'm open for us or something, you know what I mean? So it almost requires like a fluke hit or something at some point to be able to facilitate like the level of touring that would be fun, because I don't want to go out, under sort of sketchy circumstances. And I just don't want to do the whole van thing as much. So by keeping it 5 shows and sort of close to home and letting everyone know in advance, hopefully some people, can. It was a really good thing to do. We did it in 2019. So moving forward, I'd love to kind of almost do the same thing. Like the other thing that my friend Brandon suggested though was like here at the studio, I have like a really nice open live space in front of me. And obviously be easy to mic everything up and easy to film as well, with a few cameras, and maybe fill the place up with 20 or 30 friends and do like a concert here and like really film it, obviously recording it and mixing it, no problem at all. It's like the most controlled environment ever that I've been working in for 9 years. So I know it inside out.
I would
And
love
just
that.
and just So, and that would be a way of like hitting people that aren't able to come to a small run of shows that I choose to do every 3 or 4 years. You know
Mhm.
what I mean? Because that's sort of what I want to do. That being said, I've applied for a few things this summer, so if they pan out, we'll see. I'd like to do a few shows, I think, this upcoming summer.
I think the fans like myself would love to see it. Especially like you said, the online idea is brilliant because I know you have fans pretty much everywhere in all corners of the world who love what you do. So I'm sure they would love to tune in or even, be able to like download it and watch it at their own leisure or whatever it is. Uh,
Exactly, yeah.
and that's kind of like one of the benefits of the day and age we live in now. Like I'm even me being able to meet you in this context is like it's great because I get to tell you how
Amazing.
amazing what you do is, but also like get to know like the kind of the behind the scenes, like that you worked with Courtney Love, that you were such, it sounds like you're tight with Ken Andrews. Now with that, I was curious. I mean, Blinker could always tour with Failure, I assume, at some point, or maybe there's a Ken project that you
Well,
could work on, or
yeah, like, or maybe a show or something. I mean,
Mhm.
for me to go to tour in the States, it
Oh,
requires like work visas and all that kind of stuff. So it's like a whole other level.
right.
That's why I say like it would require something like, do you want to go open for Beck? Yeah. Then then it's worth hiring. It's worth hiring like an immigration lawyer, et cetera, all that stuff that it would take to put like a 5-piece Canadian band on tour in the United States. It kind of has to be worth it. Or unless you're just so deadly organized and tuned into that world. And I've been out of that world for so long.
I
I would need a guiding hand for sure. The studio is my world.
So with regards to that too, it's funny you've mentioned Beck now. Um, the 1-2 punch of August Everywhere and then listening to Sea Change a few years later in the Navy, it's like my heartbreak just kept going on. Um,
Jesus, I know. Extended. I couldn't even listen to that record. I was like, no, there's too much heartbreak records coming out. This is enough.
well, it's all great. It's all great music. And now as far as like Canadian bands, I've always been a pretty big fan of Big Wreck. Um, back in the day in the high school age, I loved Our Lady Peace. And um, are there some bands like up and coming Canadian bands that you've been prominent or noticed, or bands that you would tell people who like what you do or even just music in general would be into?
Well, my favorite band in Canada, they're in Quebec, which
Mm-hmm.
uh, is Men I Trust. They've been around for about 10 years, but there's still a lot of people that don't know them, despite their being huge, actually. And that's sort of the weird thing, is that you can be sort of off the radar huge in this day and age, which is interesting, and they're one of those bands. They can go around and play to 1,000 people in most places, and your mom still's never heard of them. They're my favorite. I love them a lot.
You
But there
said
was
that.
also there was a lot of great sort of Canadian bands that sort of, growing up, that sort of fell by the wayside and that weren't really as well known as they should have. There was this band in Toronto called the Plasticine Replicas.
Ooh.
They were absolutely incredible. Um, they had like an amazing press at the time. They were saying they're Canada's Fab Four and all this stuff, and they were part of this sort of like emerging sort of jangly mid-'80s Toronto scene that was happening, that was very sort of Brit focused, and they were wonderful. There was like this band from Montreal called The Box, who were really cool. They were like very new wave in a policey way.
Mm-hmm.
They're super, super cool. Um, I'm sure I could think of 100 if I just had all the time in the world.
I
But I really like my artwork guy, Vic Malang. You should check out his electronic stuff. It's very cool.
I love electronic stuff. Totally.
He's
Yeah.
Hamilton, just down not too far from you, I don't think.
Oh no.
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah, yeah, I mean, being from the States, the Midwest area, we have a lot of bands where you end up sitting here going like they should have been huge, or that they did that so well, and what does it amount to? But it's interesting the way the internet has morphed music fandoms, where you can again find so much so quickly, and digest like an artist's whole career in say a week, and
Hmm.
and find out so many things. And with a Blinker the Star album, I've never necessarily felt like they were, say, concept albums, but have you ever thought about doing anything like that? Or has it always just been like, I'll just title this collection kind of based on a mood? Or
Yeah, I mean, I've thought about it, but I feel like they're kind of emotional concept albums in that, like, certainly there's like a mood and a vibe that dominates this record,
Mhm.
that I don't know if I'd want to get any more specific than the way it is, like, to me it has a certain feel. It's its own thing. I mean, it sounds like me, but it's its own thing. It's sort of
Mhm.
its own mood in the catalog. And I just I'm not I don't think I'm a natural enough storyteller or weaver of a narrative thread to want to get involved too much in that. I like the musical side, and I like the sort of like um the emotional side of music, and sort of like the symbolic side of it too is very attractive to me. So
I get that.
um
And I
yeah,
get it from those
I don't
albums.
want I wouldn't want to get too much more story, like
Right.
narrative. I don't know.
Like there's gonna
Maybe,
there
maybe one
there's
day.
gonna be no Blinker the Star, The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway type albums.
Well, that's the thing. I love that stuff. But I mean, I've never digested. So that's my first or second favorite Genesis record, and I I experienced that record as a collection of songs.
Hmm.
I don't experience it as a piece, even as much as The Wall. I experience more as a piece. But like, to me, that, like, I've never um I was so entranced with the music and the meaning of individual songs to me, and the vibe of individual songs, and like counting out time and flying the windshield and all that stuff. It's like,
That's such a beautiful song. Well, not only that, but like Back in New York City was the song where
oh,
it was like, oh, well, now I just need to have all my songs have keyboards on them. Or, yeah, or,
or being 7/8 or whatever. Yeah.
yeah.
So,
Wow. Yeah, we did a episode there. They were Genesis was essentially the first band that my dad played for me on vinyl when I was a kid, and I was immediately in love with everything about it. I mean, it's weird because I felt like in the late 90s they were like the ultimate not cool band for everybody, because everybody was listening to grunge, and I was still listening to my and then there were 3 tape on my Walkman or whatever. Um, because I'm like, no, good music is good music. Shut up, guys. Um,
yeah, I think time has, like, yeah, borne out that those guys are on a different level
mhm.
altogether. By the way, just a side note, are you into Rush at all?
I do love me some Rush.
Look at this, what I found today.
Ooh, very nice.
Yeah, it's a Rush X1. It's like a Cygnus X1 beer.
Well, you're drinking with the boys tonight.
From the nectar of the rock gods themselves.
I love it. Well, I've kept you on the show for quite a bit. I really, really, really do appreciate you coming on. I don't want to keep you too long, but as a huge fan of yours, I just want to say thank you.
Oh,
And
Ryan, it means the world to me, man. I really, really appreciate it because ultimately, my ultimate goal is to communicate with
mhm,
people. It's this feeling
totally.
of to communicate. And so uh when you say those things that the communication has been received, it makes me feel very good. So thank you.
Well, you're welcome. I mean, like I said, it's been a good, I'm 41 now. It's been a good 22 years of my life listening to your music, and
Oh,
I've been there every time a new album's come out, and I've always been incredibly impressed. And I truly say this from the heart. Like, I've played it for my kids. I've as a musician myself, like I mentioned, I take a lot of inspiration from the way that you've done things. And hopefully, this episode of this show, I'll have a link in the description for people. They'll be able to check out. I made my own playlist of my favorite Blink of the Star
oh,
songs.
cool. I want to
So,
hear it.
yeah,
And send me any links to suggestions that you get after listening to Blink of the Star that like Lady Hawk. So
yeah, totally. I will. I will. Well, Jordon, it's been a pleasure having you on. I wish you well. I'm excited for the possibility of any shows or any new music. And thank you for your, I'm going to say this, thank you for your service, honestly, when it comes to music. Um, but
you're
yeah,
most welcome, Ryan. It's been a pleasure, man. Thanks so much.
yes. Take care, Jordan. And I will, everybody out there, we'll see you next week. Well, have a great holiday, ladies and gentlemen.
Over and out. Cheers, man.
Cheers, man.
That was awesome.
Thanks. Yeah, I